What if an entire family vanished from the world without actually leaving their home? No graves, no travel records, no witnesses who could fully explain what happened behind their locked doors. Just silence. Then, years later, something far more disturbing was discovered. This is not a ghost story. This is not a legend. It's a historical mystery that experts still can't fully explain. In the early 1840s, long before modern psychology could explain the darker corners of the human mind, there lived a family whose lives appeared ordinary to everyone who passed their modest countryside home. They were known as quiet, respectable people, deeply rooted in routine and discipline, and trusted enough that no one questioned their habits or beliefs. But something slowly began to change in the shadows of their daily existence, something invisible yet powerful that no one outside their walls could sense until it was far too late. What began as subtle shifts in behavior eventually turned into a decision so unnatural and horrifying that even today it feels impossible to fully understand. Without warning or public explanation, the family made a choice that defied every social law of their time. They sealed their home from the inside. The doors were locked, the shutters closed, and any visible sign of daily life began to disappear. At first, the townspeople assumed it was temporary isolation, the kind brought on by sickness or grief. But no request for help ever came, and no visitors were allowed to cross the threshold. The family, once seen tending to chores and speaking politely with neighbors, simply removed themselves from the world as thoroughly as if they had sunk beneath the ground. Days turned to weeks, and weeks slowly decayed into months, and yet nothing changed. No smoke twisted from the chimney, no movement flickered behind the curtains. There were no footsteps around the home, no deliveries taken, no conversations heard. The silence began to feel wrong, heavier than normal quiet, as though the house itself was holding its breath. People started to avoid walking too close to the property, not because of proof of danger, but because of the growing sense of dread that seemed to grow like a living thing around the walls. What made the situation even more disturbing was the complete absence of any outward signs of tragedy. There were no cries for help, no broken windows, no evidence of fire or violence. It was as though the family had calmly decided to fade out of existence while remaining physically present. Rumors began to form quietly at first, then more openly. Some spoke of religious motivations. Others whispered about strange beliefs, unspoken rituals, or forbidden knowledge passed down in old, forgotten texts. But no one knew anything for certain, because no one was ever allowed inside. Over time, the family shifted from being neighbors to becoming a kind of dark local myth. Parents warned children not to play near the house. Travelers were told to quicken their steps when passing by. Even animals seemed to avoid the place, giving it a wide and cautious distance, as if instinctively sensing that something about the home was unnatural. The isolation became legendary, but the reason behind it remained buried behind locked doors. Inside that sealed home, the family was not panicking or screaming or collapsing into chaos. Instead, they were preparing slowly and deliberately for something they believed was necessary. Their isolation was a conscious act, planned and rehearsed in silence long before it was ever carried out. They were not hiding from danger. They were creating their own reality, cutting themselves cleanly away from the world as if it were a disease they needed to escape. Every blanket was arranged with care, every object was placed with meaning, every room became part of a larger, silent ritual that no outsider would ever understand. The most terrifying part of their story was not what the town imagined, but what the family themselves believed. They did not see their isolation as madness. To them, it was discipline, it was control, it was evolution. They believed that the outside world had made people weak, restless, loud, and broken. They believed silence was strength, stillness was power, and separation was the first step toward becoming something more than human, something unburdened by hunger, pain, time, or fear. As the years passed, the silence around the house deepened into something that felt ancient, as though the building had always existed in that state. New families moved into the town and learned the story like a warning passed through generations. They were told that behind those walls a family once chose to shut themselves away from time itself. They were told that no one truly understood why. And they were told that some doors are not meant to be opened, because sometimes the most horrifying truths are not found in blood or screams, but in absolute, deliberate quiet. After the family sealed their home, the strange quiet that followed did not feel like the normal silence of an empty house. It felt intentional, controlled, and deeply unnatural. The neighbors began to measure time by the absence of sound. At first, there were stray knocks on the door by people who thought the family might be ill. No one answered. Later, there were louder attempts, voices calling out through the wooden planks, hands pounding against the frames, but the house remained mute. Weeks passed, and still no response came from within. What frightened people most was not the lack of movement, but the feeling that someone inside might still be listening. As the months stretched forward, the silence thickened into something that wrapped itself around the property. The children who dared each other to run close to the fence said they could feel coldness in the air, even in summer. Birds stopped nesting in the trees above the roof. Dogs refused to stop near the front steps, pulling their owners away with nervous whimpers. People whispered that the house had learned how not to breathe. The lack of smoke from the chimney was obvious, but the lack of any human sound felt far more terrifying, as though the structure itself had become a sealed tomb that was waiting for something to awaken inside. Years passed without the door ever opening. Winter snow piled against the walls and was never brushed away. Rain streaked down the shutters and left long, dark stains that looked like tears carved into the wood. The world outside continued to change, but the house stayed suspended in its own frozen moment. Weddings happened. Funerals were held. Children grew old enough to hear their parents recount the story of the silent house, always told in hushed tones, as if speaking too loudly might wake whatever slept within. The most disturbing part was that the house did not decay in the way abandoned homes usually do. The roof remained intact. The windows did not shatter. The structure held itself together stubbornly, as if preserving what was hidden instead of rotting away. Some people began to believe that the silence was not emptiness, but presence. They insisted that there had to be someone still alive inside, moving quietly, breathing so softly that the world outside could not detect it. This idea crawled into the minds of the town like a sickness. The concept that life might still be contained behind those walls, silently watching, silently waiting. Occasionally, someone claimed to hear something in the night, a soft, dragging noise, a faint shifting sound like fabric sliding across the floor. But whenever a lantern was raised toward the windows, nothing moved. No shadow, no flicker, just the endless, waiting dark pressed against cold glass. People started to avoid looking at the windows altogether, fearing that one day they might see a face staring back out, unblinking, unchanged by time. The silence lasted so long that it stopped feeling temporary and began to feel permanent, like a wound in the landscape that could never fully close. Children who had never known the family grew up believing that the house had always been empty, always watching, always sealed. Stories grew darker with each repetition. Some believed the family had found a way to slow their hearts and survive without food. Others believed their bodies had turned cold and spirit-like, drifting through the rooms without disturbing a single object. What terrified people the most was the realization that no laws had forced the family to this state. No one had trapped them, no disaster had sealed the door. If the silence was real, then it was chosen. And if it was chosen, it meant something was so powerful inside that house, so convincing, so overwhelming, that an entire family had willingly stepped away from touch, sound, warmth, and life itself. And that thought was far more horrifying than any scream could ever be. As the years without any sign of life continued to pass, the most unsettling part of the mystery began to take shape in the minds of those who watched the sealed house from a distance. There were no deliveries of food, no dropped-off baskets, no milk bottles left on the steps, and no footprints in the dirt that would suggest anyone was coming or going. The basic rules of survival seemed to be completely ignored, and yet there was still no evidence of death. This contradiction disturbed the town far more than if they had simply found bodies behind the locked doors. At first, practical minds tried to find ordinary explanations. Perhaps there had been a hidden cellar stocked with preserved food. Maybe there was a secret exit they could not see. But year after year passed with the same unanswered questions, and every reasonable explanation slowly fell apart under the weight of time. Even the most skeptical residents began to admit in quiet conversations that something about this situation was beyond normal understanding. What made it even more frightening was the absence of smell. Houses where people died and were left undiscovered did not stay pleasant. They decayed. They leaked their secrets through the cracks in the walls. But this house, sealed for years, never gave off the scent of rotting flesh or decay. Instead, it smelled like nothing at all, just old wood, dry air, and emptiness. That unnatural sterility became one of the most haunting details in the legend because it suggested that death, if it had happened, had not followed the rules that people understood. Neighbors also noticed small details that kept the fear alive. The curtains never shifted. The door never warped. The shutters never fell apart. It was as if time respected the home and refused to touch it. Some claimed that when the wind blew hard enough, the house made sounds like breathing, slow and heavy, as though it were alive in a way that did not require movement. No one could prove it, but enough people felt it that the idea became as real as any fact. The lack of food and water was the greatest mystery of all. No human body can go without these things for long, and yet the complete absence of deliveries suggested they had found some way to survive without them. Theories grew darker and more disturbing. Some said the family had learned how to consume almost nothing and make their bodies forget hunger. Others whispered about things that fed on the air itself, on the quiet, on the absence of light. The longer the silence lasted, the more surreal the possibilities became. Years moved forward, but nothing changed. The house did not grow wild with vines. The yard did not collapse into wilderness. It remained strangely intact, as if someone unseen was maintaining it, fixing it, preserving it, all without ever being seen. This fueled the most terrifying thought of all, that the family may have succeeded in hiding not just their lives, but their entire existence from the outside world. The idea that an entire family could survive without visible resources slowly transformed from a practical question into a psychological terror. If they could do it, then what else could be done? What if the limits of the human body were not what people believed? What if somewhere behind thick wooden doors and dusty windows, people could learn to shut down their need for food, water, warmth, and even time itself? By the time a full 17 years had passed, the lack of explanation had become heavier than any physical clue. The mystery felt alive, like something that grew stronger with every unanswered question. And the most terrifying part was not that the house stayed silent, but that it stayed untouched, preserved and waiting, as though it had been designed not for a life that was lived, but for something that was meant to remain hidden forever. Inside the home, hidden behind thick wooden doors and tightly closed shutters, an entire world existed that no one outside could see, touch, or understand. The house, once filled with the ordinary sounds of family life, footsteps on creaking floors, the clatter of dishes, laughter, and the occasional argument, had transformed into a chamber of absolute stillness. The interior seemed frozen in time, a place where the usual rhythms of life had been suspended by a deliberate force, a conscious choice made by those who lived within. The family's decision to isolate themselves for 17 years was not made lightly. It was a calculated withdrawal from reality, a surrender to a plan that defied both common sense and the natural laws that governed every other household in the surrounding countryside. The family had created a system, however strange and unnatural, that allowed them to remain completely secluded. Rooms that once served everyday purposes, kitchens, bedrooms, and living spaces, were organized meticulously, almost ritualistically, suggesting that every object had a reason for being exactly where it was. Beds were made with precision, blankets folded and stacked, chairs returned to exact positions against tables. It was not the chaos of neglect, but the careful maintenance of order, without any visible hands tending to it. There was an eerie sense that the house itself was being treated as a living organism, a body that required attention and care, even if the family within remained entirely hidden from view. Outside observers could only speculate about what was happening behind the walls. Some imagined that the family had developed a method to sustain themselves without traditional food or water, a technique that drew on discipline, mental control, or even forces beyond human understanding. Others whispered of rituals, dark practices that intertwined science and superstition, where the mind could override the body and the body could, in turn, manipulate the passage of time. Theories grew increasingly elaborate as the years passed, each one more disturbing than the last. What terrified people the most was not the idea that the family might be surviving in secret, but that they had willingly surrendered to a method of life so alien, so extreme, that no outsider could ever fully grasp it. The structure of the house itself seemed to amplify the isolation. Windows were shuttered so tightly that sunlight barely filtered through. Doors were reinforced with locks and bolts, preventing anyone from entering. Even the walls seemed thicker than normal, as if designed to muffle sound and shield the interior from the outside world. There were no cracks or gaps for air, water, or human observation. The very architecture of the home became a symbol of the family's withdrawal, a fortress built not to protect from intruders, but to protect from existence itself. Those who passed by the house often reported a feeling of unease, a creeping sense that something within was aware, watching or waiting, even though no human presence could be seen. Inside, the family's daily life, or what remained of it, was governed by patterns that defied human needs as we understand them. Sleep was not occasional. It was a continuous state of near-complete stillness, almost like hibernation. Eating, drinking, and speaking became rare or entirely absent activities, replaced by a rhythm dictated by an inner discipline no one outside could imagine. Some suggested that they had discovered a way to slow their metabolisms, to quiet their bodily functions to the point where years could pass without traditional nourishment. Others feared that the house had absorbed their presence, that the family had become part of the structure itself, their physical bodies preserved in a state that bordered on the supernatural. The line between life and non-existence blurred inside those walls, leaving anyone who tried to understand it unsettled and disoriented. The psychological toll on the family must have been immense, though no one could confirm it. To live for 17 years in near-total isolation, without human interaction or external stimuli, would strain the mind in ways unimaginable. And yet, whatever method or belief system had been employed, allowed them to endure. Perhaps it was faith, perhaps it was sheer will, or perhaps it was something else entirely, a combination of mental and physical conditioning that allowed them to escape the basic laws that govern ordinary human life. Every year that passed without a peep from the home only deepened the sense of horror for those outside, reinforcing the idea that this was not mere disappearance, but a deliberate and controlled experiment in human endurance and transformation. Even after decades, the house remained a source of fascination and fear. Historians, psychologists, and local residents alike struggled to understand what could drive a family to such extreme measures. No records explained their choice, no first-hand accounts survived. All that remained were the silent walls, carefully maintained interior, and the impossible knowledge that a human family had endured an existence so removed from ordinary life that it defied comprehension. The house became a monument not only to isolation, but to the terrifying possibilities of what the human mind and body might achieve when removed from the world entirely, when time itself becomes a tool rather than a boundary. The final and perhaps most chilling element of this story is the lingering uncertainty that surrounds the family's fate, a question that has haunted the town and historians for generations. After 17 years, when curiosity, or perhaps necessity, finally led someone to open the locked doors, the house revealed a scene that defied logic and left witnesses with more questions than answers. There were no bodies, no skeletal remains, and no visible signs of struggle. Every piece of furniture, every object, every corner of the home appeared as though frozen in time. Beds were neatly made, chairs perfectly aligned, utensils placed with deliberate care. It was as if the family had stepped out for a moment and simply never returned, except that the outside world offered no evidence of their existence beyond the walls they had sealed. Inside, the discovery of personal belongings suggested a level of intentionality and preparation far beyond ordinary means. Journals, notebooks, and handwritten notes were left behind, revealing glimpses into their thinking and the extraordinary plan they had undertaken. The writings described attempts to mimic the natural world, particularly the cycles of hibernating animals, and outlined methods to control their physical states over extended periods of time. The family claimed to have slowed their heart rates, controlled their breathing, and subdued hunger in a way that bordered on the impossible. They spoke of dreams that lasted months, and a mental clarity achieved only through prolonged isolation, implying that their minds had found ways to sustain themselves when the bodies seemed dormant. Yet the final entries were abrupt and incomplete, leaving their ultimate intentions a mystery, their voices frozen in time as haunting echoes. No trace of the family was ever found outside the home. There were no bodies in the yard, no hidden tunnels, no neighboring houses reporting visits, no travel records indicating they had left. It was as if they had vanished entirely, leaving only a house that seemed alive with their memory, but devoid of physical presence. This absence challenged the most fundamental understanding of life and death, forcing those who examined the case to consider possibilities that were almost too extraordinary to accept. Had they discovered a way to survive without nourishment, without movement, without interaction? Or had they somehow transcended the physical world entirely, leaving behind only the shell of their existence in the carefully preserved home? The town's reaction to the discovery was one of profound unease. People who had lived their entire lives hearing stories about the silent house found themselves face to face with the eerie reality that the family might have succeeded in achieving something beyond ordinary comprehension. Local historians debated the findings, psychologists speculated on the limits of human endurance, and storytellers wove increasingly elaborate theories about occult practices, hidden sciences, and experiments that blurred the line between life and death. Yet none could provide definitive answers, and the house itself, preserved against decay and untouched by time, became a monument to the unknown, a physical embodiment of a question no one could fully answer. Even decades later, the house continued to attract attention. Visitors reported strange sensations, a sense of being watched, fleeting shadows, and the unshakable feeling that the silence itself held a presence. Scholars who examined the journals noted meticulous attention to detail, a logic that suggested the family had been methodical rather than delusional. But the absence of conclusive evidence left open the possibility that the family's experiment had succeeded beyond measure, or failed in ways that no one could measure at all. The ambiguity became central to the horror, because the human mind fears most what it cannot define, and the story of this family offered nothing concrete, only the lingering certainty that they had taken a path entirely removed from ordinary existence. The unanswered questions surrounding their fate continued to inspire speculation and terror. Were the family's claims in the journals literal truth, or were they the product of a collective delusion carefully cultivated over years of isolation? Could human beings truly enter a state of suspended animation without modern technology, or had some unknown factor played a role, something the observers could never understand? And if such feats were possible, what does that imply about the limits of human endurance and the unknown capacities of the mind and body? The very fact that the family's disappearance remains unexplained fuels a type of fear that is more profound than any ghost story or violent crime. It is a fear rooted in possibility, in the uncomfortable thought that humans might be capable of extreme acts beyond the comprehension of those who watch from the outside, and that the rules governing life, death, and time are not as rigid as we believe. The house, journals, and lingering mystery together form a record of something extraordinary, something terrifying, and something wholly unknowable. Even today, those who hear the story are drawn to it, captivated not by what is known but by what cannot be explained. The family that hibernated like bears for 17 years remains a haunting enigma, a challenge to reason and imagination alike, and a reminder that some doors, once closed, may hide truths so unsettling that the mind refuses to accept them, truths that continue to linger just beyond the reach of human understanding.